Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And on behalf of the state's team, attorneys Crawford and Sitzberger and myself, as well as detectives Hoppy and Plennis and Ms. DeVolcanier, thank you so much for paying such close attention during this trial. I have to say that it stuck out in my head when I would look over at how carefully you were all listening, and we really do appreciate that. This is my opportunity to argue the case. The evidence is in, and soon you'll be asked to deliberate whether we've met our burden in this case on all three counts. All three counts follow this theme of murder, greed, and lies that my co-counsel introduced during opening statements. And that's how we'll discuss it here this morning, starting with count 1, the first-degree intentional homicide of Lynn Hernon, and moving into the greed. Count 2 being the theft while Ms. Hernon was alive, and count 3 being the theft from Ms. Hernon's estate. When we talk about count 1, the judge just read you the elements. Ladies and gentlemen, we submit to you that in this case, Ms. Kurczewski caused Lynn Hernon's death with the intent to kill her. You heard moments ago that it's not necessary that every fact be proven directly by a witness or an exhibit, and that in fact circumstantial evidence can be just as powerful. Whether it's direct or circumstantial evidence, the only thing that matters is whether it satisfies you beyond a reasonable doubt. The circumstances in this case are significant. The cause of death in this matter, as determined by Dr. Bedritsky, is poisoning. Tetrahydrozoline is a poison. Dr. Bedritsky talked to you about her job. It is her job for Waukesha County to make determinations on cause and manner of death. She told you that it took her almost a year to do that in this case. She was the only expert who actually saw Ms. Hernon. She performed the autopsy. She testified that she viewed Ms. Hernon's tissues microscopically. She sent numerous toxicological samples to NMS labs. She reviewed thousands of pages of medical records. She conducted research and consulted with other experts and considered the facts at the death scene. And ultimately, she told you, without hesitation, that the poisoning that occurred in this case was at the hand of another. That's what homicide means. Death at the hand of another. Dr. Bedritsky was not here to tell you who did that. She was not concerned with that at all when making these determinations. That's not her job. But she did testify that she considers this case to be unique in a couple different ways. Definitely, the toxicology was atypical. That scene was atypical. And she told you it was atypical both because of things that were there and things that weren't there. Like tetrahydrozoline bottles. Dr. Bedritsky told you that it was significant to her that of all the medication, pills, and bottles, and powders at the scene, that Ms. Hernon's toxicology did not indicate elevated levels of those prescriptions. Certainly not fatal levels. There was only one poison in Ms. Hernon's toxicology, and it was eye drops, and they weren't on the scene. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that the misleading scene that caused investigators from day one to believe this was a pill overdose was very intentional. It was intentional by the only person who was there, other than Ms. Hernon. It was an intentional way to mislead. This theme of Ms. Kurczewski's intent being to mislead will carry us through the rest of the discussion this morning. And the motive? To get out of trouble, right? Because what was presented by Ms. Kurczewski to the first responders at the scene was not at all what the actual cause of death was. Ms. Kurczewski talked about how ill Ms. Hernon had been, how she liked to use her pills. There's no suicide note. Dr. Bedritsky talked to you. Ms. Hernon was not on the verge of death. This chart looks at the substances we've talked about so many times in this case. Again, only one of them is a poison. And I submit to you that the fact that the poison is in the toxicology is circumstantial evidence of the person's intent who gave it to her. The other substances underneath the tetrahydrozoline are not anywhere near fatal levels. Dr. Bedritsky told you that even together, those other substances would not have caused the death because it was the tetrahydrozoline that was so significant that that level was fatal. You were asked to make a lot of assumptions about perhaps Ms. Hernon's character, I guess, in the fact that the baclofen and cyclobenzaprine were even there, right? Because she had been told to stop taking those. They shouldn't have been there. They shouldn't have been there. You kept being told. They shouldn't have been there. The tetrahydrozoline shouldn't have been there at all, because if she was using it as eye drops, it would have been under 1. The level would have been under 1.0. The reason Ms. Hernon wasn't taking baclofen and cyclobenzaprine is because she herself reported having side effects she didn't like. And they were not life-threatening side effects. They were rashes. They were salt in her mouth. They were weight gain. When you think about all of the counts in this case, you're going to have to think about who Ms. Hernon was. And I want you to think about the different sources of information that you've received during this trial about Ms. Hernon. And consider the sources of that information. You heard in this case from 3 of Ms. Hernon's closest friends, people that she loved. Anthony Poza told you he would go over there and she'd make him lunch during college, and they'd talk about movies, black and white movies. They'd talk about her dad, who was in the military. Corrine Poza showed you birthday cards that she still had from Ms. Hernon. She was a very thoughtful person. She liked to cook. You heard that she would bring food to parties. Corrine Poza told you that they had an affinity for shoes together, and she laughed a little when she looked at that note on one of the birthday cards. Corrine Poza told you that she had gone thrift shopping and rummaging with Ms. Hernon because she loved to get a deal. Ms. Hernon was making plans with these people. Jim Kelleher told you they were making plans because he still had a birthday gift for her after she got out of the hospital. Anthony Poza and Keith Lang saw Ms. Hernon after they had had lunch, and she made plans to see Anthony soon. Ms. Hernon was always thoughtful about her appearance, and that's significant. She gave gifts that were meaningful, not necessarily expensive. She was overall, as we've seen in the patterns presented, frugal. She had a very high credit score. She paid cards down. She didn't spend a ton of money. She certainly was not someone who used technology very well. In fact, Ms. Poza told you that when she'd have photos of Anthony, Ms. Hernon would want her to physically send those to get printed so she could pick them up. She could not even manipulate the photo application on a smartphone, let alone some of the other things that she's been alleged to have been involved with in this case. She loved her pets, and you heard even from the insurance agent, she was a thoughtful person, making Christmas gifts of food, low-cost items. That is in great juxtaposition with how Ms. Hernan's been portrayed in this trial. You heard over and over that she was angry. She was so angry, she was giving up. She wanted to get rid of all of her money. For some unknown reason, she wanted to have no more liquidity at the time of her death. She was suicidal. How many times did you hear these things about Ms. Hernan? And the suggestion that she was apparently scamming the government because she got food share. Hiding assets from the government to accept government assistance. I want you to think about the sources of these kind of attributes for Ms. Hernan. Because ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to have to make credibility determinations in this case. And you have to consider what intent the source of information had. Was it to mislead you? Was it to shift your focus? What's the motive behind those kind of statements? You need to consider that when you're deciding about intent. Because at the core of this case really is the defendant's intent and the lack of consent for those theft counts. And those are all questions that Ms. Hernan can't answer because she was murdered. That's why these questions have to be answered with circumstantial evidence. And that includes motive, which is different from intent. But it's someone's reason for doing something. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that in this case, Ms. Kurczewski's intent is clear. It was to kill. The intent behind her lies is to mislead. And the motive is her own personal benefit, whether it be getting out of trouble or money. Count 2 is the theft while Ms. Hernan was alive. Again, these two things Ms. Hernan can't tell you about, so we rely on the circumstances. One significant one is the difference in the patterns that you saw between Ms. Hernan and Ms. Kurczewski in this case. There was testimony about this and information gleaned from all of the financial records about these. Ms. Hernan was paying cards down. She had a great credit score. She wasn't using a ton of ATMs. She wasn't lavishly spending, right? You heard that she bought herself a vehicle and some jewelry, but really other than that, she's not going on vacations. She's not buying computers and iPads and things, televisions, and she's spending her money in Waukesha County in person, not online. You saw the patterns of Ms. Kurczewski in this case. The credit cards are close to their max. There's a lot of ATM and cash advances. The spending is happening at places where Ms. Kurczewski can get cash out and gamble. Whether it be a casino or a bar, there's been testimony in this case that Ms. Kurczewski spent significant sums of money on slot machines in the geographic area where she lived, and additionally, using a lot of online activity. You were shown this credit score comparison, and you'll see that when Ms. Hernan's score plummets is the same time that all those credit card accounts are maxing out, becoming due. No payments are being made on loans. Her score plummets in the last 3 or 4 months before her death. And ladies and gentlemen, the financial aspect of this case and the investigation even was very complex. It took a lot of time. There were a lot of records. There were a lot of things that needed to be put out in a timeline or patterns so that we could understand it. It was not a simple review. I submit to you that that was exactly Ms. Kurczewski's intent. The intent to mislead and the motive for financial gain. We focused on these accounts, the top 3 belonging to Ms. Hernan and the bottom 2 belonging to the defendant. And we talked about the theft coming out of Lynn's accounts and going into the defendant's accounts. That money market account was the big account that there was $250 grand in, right? That was an account that Ms. Hernan didn't pay bills from. She didn't write a check to, We Energies from the money market account. And Detective Plentis told you why that was, because there's penalties on an account like that for too many transactions. So what you saw happening as a pattern was that Ms. Hernan would move money from the money market account into her own checking account where she'd pay bills. The only checks written from this account, aside from one, go to the defendant. No one else is getting thousands of dollars from this account. There's memo lines shown along the right side. I submit to you that the intent behind those memo lines is to mislead. Because that's not what these funds were used for. We painstakingly went through Ms. Kurczewski's spending habits. There was no IRS payment. She got a tax return that year. There were no doctor bills for procedures, endoscopy procedures. There was not huge sums of money going to car payments. There were thousands and thousands of dollars a month spent at Stalis Palace. That's what you saw on the defendant's finances. A bank account that held $250,000 less than 2 years later had $87 and change in it. And $134,000 plus of that money went to the defendant in the form of 20 checks. The last 2 entries on here were electronic checks. Both written October 1st of 2018, 2 days before Ms. Hernan dies. And I say written, but they really weren't written, were they? Because they're electronic. This is internet check. What's the top one for? $5,000 to the defendant. And the bottom one is a check that went directly to the defendant's mom's apartment complex. These funds came out of the BMO money market account. These checks were made online. On the same day these checks were written, the defendant, who never had a BMO account of her own, downloads the BMO Harris mobile banking app. Lynn Hernan was not creating electronic checks 2 days before she died on the internet. The other main account of Ms. Hernan's was her checking account, the 5336 account. And during the trial, we focused a lot on the checks written from the money market account and this checking account. But there were also expenditures that we didn't include in the total, including over $4 grand spent on her check card while she was in the hospital. $4,000. She was only in the hospital from September 15th through the 28th. Whose spending pattern does $4 grand in 2 weeks sound like? There was over $3 grand of transactions after Ms. Hernan's death. We know that she wasn't using her check card. And ultimately, of all the checks that Ms. Hernan wrote from her checking account, included paying bills and over $10,000 in checks to the defendant. It's very telling when you look at two of those checks from Ms. Hernan's checking account. Ms. Hernan certainly knew how to give a gift if she wanted to. When Anthony graduated high school, Ms. Hernan's intent was to give him $200. So she wrote a check, and in the memo line, it says graduation. There's one other check in the form of a gift from this checking account. It's to Ms. Kurczewski. The memo line says gift. Look at the value of that check. $2,612.17 for a gift. Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Kurczewski is the only person in Ms. Hernan's life getting gifts like that. There is absolutely nothing in this record for you to conclude that people like Anthony stopped caring about Ms. Hernan or that she stopped caring about him. Absolutely nothing. This makes no sense because the date of the $2,600 that Ms. Kurczewski got was July 22nd of 16. She didn't graduate from high school that day. She didn't get married. She didn't have a baby.
Object to information that's not in the record, Judge.
Overruled.
That check is not to celebrate a monumental part of Ms. Kurczewski's life, like the $200 that Anthony got when he graduated. When you add up these checks, you get that total that we talked about before. And ladies and gentlemen, that was Ms. Kurczewski's primary source of income. Right? You saw her paychecks over the span of almost 2 years total less than 50 grand. Her income was stealing from Ms. Hernan. And she never paid a dime of it back. This total of over $144,000 does not take into account several other pieces that are very suspicious in this case and give another piece of circumstantial evidence for you when you consider, is this really what Lynn wanted? In February of 2018, a loan is applied for 30 grand is what ultimately gets approved. At that point in time, Ms. Hernan is not in some sort of dire financial situation. She's not trying to buy a home. There's absolutely no reason gleaned from Ms. Hernan's financial accounts that she would need this kind of a loan in February of 2018. I submit to you that the way that this loan was applied for, that's not something that Ms. Hernan was capable of doing, frankly. Because these documents on the left, this kitten check, I've highlighted the last four of the account number on the bottom of that check. That was given to Goldman Sachs to say, here's the account we want this money to go in, right? It has Lynn Hernan's name on it, but that's the defendant's account. The 8149 account did not have Lynn Hernan on it when this application was made. And what that means to you, ladies and gentlemen, is that that is fraud. It's not real. That check is not real. What else isn't real that Goldman Sachs received? We went through painstaking detail about the different financial banking support documents that loan provider received. Again, they're fraud. They are fraudulent. Someone who knows how to create documents and manipulate information turned the bank account information of herself to look like it was Ms. Hernan's. The information that Marcus Goldman Sachs was given during this application process includes that phone number that we've talked about, 262-421-5290. Detectives told you that is not a number that Lynn Hernan used. We know one person that used that number, and it was the defendant who gave it over the phone to a bank when she was pretending to be Lynn Hernan. The intent behind this is to mislead. The motive is financial gain. Ms. Kurczewski has to then add Lynn Hernan to this account before the money is dispersed because the loan is in Lynn Hernan's name. So the money gets put in to Jessy Kurczewski's account on March 8th of 2018, $30,000. And this was all done online. Ladies and gentlemen, Lynn Hernan knew how to give gifts if she wanted to give gifts. There are such more simple ways of transferring money to someone than this. And that circumstance goes directly to consent. That loan ultimately has some payments made from the estate account. Right? Goldman Sachs is saying there's minimum payments due on this loan. The defendant pays 3 times out of the Tri-City account, all the while having never listed that $30,000 loan on the final accounting. Ms. Kurczewski never discloses it. She never pays it. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that's because her intent was to mislead and her motive was for financial gain. We know Ms. Kurczewski is accessing these accounts without Ms. Hernan, because this call placed near Ms. Kurczewski's mom's house is a call to the bank. If we could play that, please.
Thank you for calling City. My name's Melanie. Can I have your name as it appears on your card?
Lynn A. Hernan.
This is another circumstance for you to consider when you're trying to determine whether all of this financial activity was done with Ms. Hernan's consent. If she's with Ms. Hernan and Ms. Hernan wants her to have all this money, why do you have to pretend to be her on the phone? There's evidence in this record that Ms. Hernan knew how to make a call to make a transfer of funds, to talk to her bank on the phone. There's absolutely no logical reason why Ms. Kurczewski would have to call any of these banks and pretend to be Ms. Hernan. The intent was to mislead, and the motive was for financial gain. And that's why all of Ms. Kurczewski's information is on the victim's credit report, which the defense showed you. Exhibit 621. Ms. Kurczewski's P.O. box, her phone number, and the 5290 number are all on here. Another circumstance for you to consider in terms of whether this was all with consent. Ms. Kurczewski gave a pretty detailed account of what she and Ms. Hernan did on October 3rd of 2018, multiple times in those interviews. And when you look at these, it's actually quite morbid. Ms. Hernan is either being poisoned, dying, or dead, And Jennifer Flower gets a new 75-inch TV and an Apple Watch on Ms. Hernan's dime. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that Lynn Hernan did not have the desire to have a JCPenney credit card opened up the day she died. Most or all of these things happening online, which Ms. Hernan also didn't do. At this point in time, the money market is depleted, the checking account is depleted, and the credit cards are maxed out. But there's still money for Ms. Kurczewski after Ms. Hernan is dead. Because when Ms. Hernan dies, Ms. Kurczewski then files for the informal administration in the probate estate. Her and Anthony Poza are the beneficiaries, and immediately, Anthony told you that it was odd how quickly Ms. Kurczewski told him, you have to sign off on this stuff so we can get the estate going. And after that point in time, ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you that the Tri-City estate account became Ms. Kurczewski's source of income.